Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, top of page 1287. And to sum up what we learned, is the Rebbe Rashab is explaining how, in addition to Torah mitzvahs on its own, so on its own meaning, not on its own as in order to perform or learn Torah and do any mitzvah, you need to have a neshama, you need to have a human being, but meaning on its own without the ava b'chol meidecha, what he called ava rabba, the hagdama of that intense love, b'chol meidecha, as we discussed earlier at length, with pages upon pages he spoke about, and I can refer you back where this was discussed at length, the two different levels of b'chol meidecha, the all-consuming love that comes after mutfa, murgesh, muskel. I think it's important to remember that because I think we keep referring to Ava B'chol Meidecha. You have to keep in mind that there's a long discussion about what that means. And that is that it's a growth process that a person grows from childhood. In Avodah, the early stages of work where you begin first with the natural inclinations, your connection to emotional connection to God and to purpose is more based on your own survival. And then you grow cognitively and emotionally, as we learned, to the level of murgesh, where you start feeling, your mind begins to giving direction and guidance. And all the stages that he discussed, I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but then suddenly, then you come to a point of not suddenly cognitive growth. So if you think about it, it's just like a child grows. We don't become 20-year-olds overnight. It takes 20 years. The same thing with Avodah. It takes time to get through all these stages. And being that most of us, if not all of us, have not really gone through these stages in Avodah, we've only learned it on paper. So it's obvious that where he's talking here, he's talking about someone who's achieved the state of this level, at least commensurate to their place, meaning each person relative to their situation. So we're talking now a level that's gone through all these levels. I mean, if we had V'ahavta b'chol levavcha, we'd be happy. B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha is already the ultimate. And that itself was considered to be the highest level where both the cognitive and the emotions of the person is negei b'nefesh. For how many people can say that their lives are completely consumed, they can't live without God? We're doing quite fine in our material worlds. I'm only trying to point out not how far we are, that when we're learning this, we need to put our mindset in that place. If you really want to appreciate what he's saying here, so he's saying it's not just doing Torah mitzvahs, it's doing it with this full, complete absorption where you've reached these highest levels of b'chol meidecha, again, relative each person to where they are at. So that introduces the chodesh, what we called earlier the yichud pnimi and so on, that brings a new unprecedented energy from the helam ha'atzmi. So that was the general gist of what he was saying until the bottom of page 1286. And I said, to go back again, I was going to give you the page where he talks about, after he goes, Chachma and Bina. So there's the piece, let me see, where's the B'chol Meidecha? Here we go. Page 1245. And that's only one section. It's really much before that and after that. But 1245 is where it really gets heavy into the whole discussion of what is Ava B'chol Meidecha. 1245 through 1249, and then obviously before and after is all part of it. But those are the main pages. So if you want to refresh yourself, go back there, you'll get a sense, what is this Ava B'chol Meidecha he's talking about here? And of course, since it's coming from the Neshamas that are rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi, higher than Torah Mitzvahs, which is rooted in the Gilui, the divine power of Gilui. Both are Atzmi, because they're both before the Tzimtzum, and they're both precede existence, but one is still the world of Gilui, and Gilui, at the end of the day, even the highest revelation to yourself, is still ultimately in the same realm as revelation to the other, as we discussed. Whereas Neshamas enter into another realm, the realm of things that remain fundamentally concealed. So when Neshama does the Aveda b'chol meidecha, what he calls Ava Rabba, the Hagdom of Ava Rabba, in Avarabim Chol Meidech Mesiris Nefesh, there you have drawing from that deeper inner place. And I explained more details in previous classes. I'm not going to go through it all again now. But then he started Ubafrat, the bottom of page 1286 and into 1287, which we learned yesterday. And this is specifically through tshuva, ma'aver rabba. He's still using the word aver rabba, but now he's talking about tshuva. And specifically, he clearly says tshuva, not just tshuva ilah, returning and connecting to God, tshuva ilah. That you could say maybe is b'chol moedecha. We're talking tshuva shara atzmei nepach l'teiv, where you're transforming the negative, the evil into good, the transgressions, the zdenius into merits. So he says through this is nimshach umizgala b'chinas helam ha'atzmi the ein sof. It draws and reveals this helam ha'atzmi, as I explained at length yesterday. And here he brings it back to the same language that he used earlier, which I referred you already to, which is that this same is the same level as shmoi ha'atzmi. This was on page 1270. Shmoi ha'atzmi, he called it, the core name as it's kolol ba'atzmusei mamish. That's not Hoyahu Shmoi Bovad, because there he said clearly Shmoi, the name is already a name Havaya, and it's already Nimshach Min Ha'atzmus. It's not only Nimshach, it's not only transmitted, it's not only extended, it's a revelation, even if it's the highest state of revelation. But here we're talking about there's Ein B'chinas Hamshacha, Kol Ba'atzmusei, and he also calls it B'chinas Hayachelus. So it's a state of divine, the capacity of Asmus. Then he continues, V'nizbar le'il, the Yeshlemer, that the root of the Keli is in this place, in this Helam Ha'atzmi, which is Muhus V'atzmus the Ein Sof, where he said clearly on page 1269 that is only the level, actually 1267, I should say. On 1267, he said, is the level of Ein Sof. I just want to read the exact words. And this Keli is Mahuz v'Atzmus Ein Sof. Those were the words he used there. One second. Ein Sof. We came to the 1268 as well. Yeah. Just looking for one expression specifically. Oh, here we are. Is from Atzmus Hus Ein Sof Baruch Hu, which is what we're discussing now. It's still not Atzmus, but it's a deeper dimension that defies and is above revelation altogether. So that's what we learned. This is what we learned yesterday. So transformation of the Zdeinis Kazachis, and I explained how that relates to the Kalim, because in general, we're talking about anything that is not just a pure revelation, is already so-called revealing the deeper essence of the divine power to conceal, divine power to withhold, or refrain, or restraint. And this creates a Gilui Chodesh Mamish, which comes from Eden Ilah, Umchins and Stima, and this will be the ultimate revelation, La'osid, as we learned earlier, that this, in the future, will be the ultimate revelation, the Gilui Lamata Begufim Dafke, Commission is Bar Le'il. That this essential divine level will be revealed in the future, and this is higher than just the regular revelation that happens through, which is also a very high level, to Torah mitzvahs without these deeper dimensions of B'chol Meidecha or Tshuva that he just described. So though we learn further, I'm going to go back now to Va'inyan Hu and connected back to what we learned back on page, as I said, 1213 through 1215. Ani Rishon v'ani Achron. So I gave an introduction to this piece yesterday, so I'm not going to go over that introduction. I'll just sum up by saying that he's now going to reconnect it to the levels within Ishtalshlus, where you see this play itself out, this idea that the lowest is rooted in the highest. So here in this context, we're talking about that the Kalim. And when you do it in the form of B'chol Meidecha and Tshuva, and specifically Tshuva Ma'ava, what happens is you reveal the highest level within the containers, not just as the containers are drawing the Eir within the Keli, which we learned earlier is what Shmoi does. That's the level of Shmoi, Havaya, Torah Mitzvahs, the regular Torah Mitzvahs. But we're now revealing the highest levels into existence in the Kelim and the transformation of the Keli into the Eir in that sense. So he's going to bring it now back that these two levels, the root, which is the highest level, is Keser, and the way it comes down below is Malchus. So in the regular routine of things, Malchus is the lowest of the 10 spheres. And Keser is the highest, or even above the highest. But through the Aveda, we come to discover that actually Malchus is rooted all the way in the highest. Just as like we're speaking here, the Kelim are rooted in a place that's higher than Eir. So if you're talking about the levels of Giluyim and Eir and Gilui, so of course Chachma is higher than Bina, and Bina is higher than Das, and higher than Chesed and Gvura, and that's the order. And Malchus, as we'll soon see, and as we learned earlier, Les Lamegamo Klum is the expression. It has nothing of its own. Like the moon has no light of its own. It's a reflection of sunlight. And yet, when the proper Aveda, you reveal that its root is higher than the sun. That the root of Malchus is higher than Zah and ultimately higher than all the spheres. All the way to Keser and the root of Keser in the highest levels. So he's really going to just explain what we just learned, but bring it back to the language that we learned much earlier, Keser and Malchus, as I said, page 113, 1 through 115, which takes us back to the beginning of this whole discussion. And here you see how the Rebbe Rashab is tying it all together. So the pasuk he's using is Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron. Rishon is going to be the highest level, Keser. Achron is going to be Malchus, and we'll see now how he applies what we learned to these levels. It goes like this: for Inyan Hu, and the Inyan of this is commission is Bar Le'il, and that's again 12:13. Be Inyan Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron. I am the first and I am the last, says God. The Ani Rishon b'chinas Keser. I am the first is the level of Keser. Ubesharshe ubchinis Keser Malchus the Ein Sof, and its root, it's Keser Malchus of Ein Sof, meaning before the Tzimtzum. The lowest level before the Tzimtzum is called Malchus the Ein Sof. You're calling Keser Malchus. Keser Malchus the Ein Sof. Oy Keser Akloli. Keser even higher than Malchus, the general Keser. Or he could be meaning here Keser Akloli of this whole Seder Shtalshus. To me, it seems like Keser Akloli before the Tzimtzum. The general Ratzon Klali. Keser is another name for Ratzon. So there's God's general desire for the whole thing. Now, what is this level? In its root, this is what he referred to in this line 2 here, that this is the Shmoya Atzmi, not as it emerges in Hu and Shmoy, but as it's encompassed in Atzmusei Mamish, like he spoke on the top of the page, which is Nehelam Atzmi. That's where ultimately Ani Rishon refers to these highest levels. So it's Keser, in a root Keser Malchus or Keser Kloli, and ultimately this level of Shmoya Atzmi, Kol Batzmuse. In the parentheses, we'll go over the parentheses again. So just like in Keser, you find two levels. Since we find, according to what it says elsewhere, about the inner and outer dimension of Keser, since we're talking about Nir Rishon is Keser, you can say, possibly say, the Bechinis Helema Eir Hanal, the Helema Eir Hanal, meaning Helam here, most likely he means the Helema Eir the helam hashayach legilui, not the helam ha'atzmi. The helam that is concealed, but it's only concealed from another, but not fundamentally concealed. That is the outer dimension of Kesser. So Hanal would be referring to what he said earlier about the helam hashayach legilui. I only derive that from the second half of the statement. U'b'chinas helam ha'atzmi, and the core helam, which is fundamentally concealed because it remains completely beyond the realm and domain of revelation, that's primius hakesed. Who kedugma is b'chinas primius hakesed, and it's only kedugma. It's only an example. Since we're explaining Kesser, he's bringing that these two dimensions can be seen in Kesser itself. There's two levels of helam, which we also learned earlier. In Chachmas Tima, we learned the helam that just concealed from that which comes beneath it, and then a fundamental helam ha'atzmi. So it's now saying in the highest levels that these are the two levels here that we're talking about in Kesser. That's Ani Rishon. What about Ani Achron? Ani Achron ub'chinas Malchus d'Atzilus. That's the lowest sphere, Malchus of Atzilus. So clearly he's talking starting from Atzilus, Malchus and Kesser of Atzilus, but taking us all the way to Atzilus, the Klolus. Remember the macrocosmic Atzilus, which is before the Tzimtzum. So whatever is taking place in the microcosm of Atzilus, so too is happening in the macrocosm, obviously in a more subtle and less defined, a completely ethereal and non-defined level. But still, as I've explained many times, the Eibishter wants us to have be privy to some of the inner workings, even behind the curtain of the Tzimtzum. Okay. And now, what's the connection? Ani Rishon v'ani Achron. Fine, I am the first, I am the last. Now here's the link. The noatz seifen b'tchiloson, and here's the rule for the Sefer Yetzirah. The end, noatz means wedged. The end is wedged in the beginning. So Achron is wedged in Rishon. The tchiloson b'seifon. And Rishon, tchiloson, the beginning is wedged in the end. So Achron is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged into the end, into Malchus. Kesser Malchus, the beginning Malchus. That this level of Malchus, just like we spoke with the Kalim before, Shorsha b'chinas helam ha'atzmi. Its real root is higher than all the revealed spheres. It's in the helam ha'atzmi. V'zehu, and this is the reason, and this is the meaning, the b'chinas Malchus, the b'chinas helam be'etzem. This is what it means when you say Malchus is fundamentally helam. How do we know that? The sira less la megarmo klum. Because the moon, which is the level of Malchus, has nothing of its own. That's an expression from Zohar. Less law has nothing, megarmo of its own. Klum. Absolutely nothing of its own. Megarmo means of its own. Shu choshech be'etzem. It's fundamentally a darkened state. Not darkness compared to light or a concealment that will become revealed. But choshech be'etzem. That's Malchus. V'chein ikar inyan hakelim u'b'chinas Malchus dafke. And I was connecting it. And same when you talk about the container, where the containers, where's their prominent dominance? It's in Malchus. Because ultimately, even though Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvur, Teferes, Netzach, Chayd, Yesod all have kelim, but there the oir is a factor as well. The keli is a keli to the oir. In Malchus, because the oir is because it's darkened like the moon on its own, doesn't have oir of its own. So it's fundamentally choshesh. So the primary place of kelim is dafke Malchus. I see this is the Rebbe Rashab is writing very briefly, but I'll explain it all because there's no question that this could be elaborated upon. And v'hainu, which means b'pnei shorsha b'pchinas helam ha'atzmi, due to its root in the helam ha'atzmi. So now he's introduced that Malchus, like Kalim, and Kalim, like Malchus, are rooted in the helam ha'atzmi, which is in the higher level of Kesser, like he said, going all the way to the highest levels. And now comes the punchline. Ukasher hakeli yishapich v'yiyeh oir. Now, when the keli is transformed into not just being a container, a channel of energy, but you reveal in it through what he spoke, Ava b'chol ma'adecha, and Tshuva ma'ava. And so then the keli is transformed, and it becomes oir hainu, v'hainu, and that means she is gala b'chinas helam ha'oir b'chinas helam ha'atzmi. It's being revealed. The Helam Ha'oyer, which we learned earlier is the first level. The Keli is the concealment of the Oyer. You're revealing that dimension. And then even higher than that, the Helam Ha'atzmi. And ultimately all the way to the Shmoy HaKol Batzmusei. This was all said on 1270. So the Rebbe Rashab is using words and expressions he already spoke about. Yeah. You look at the end of the paragraph on 1270, the top paragraph, you'll see literally the same words he's using there. He's using here, he used there. So it's tying it all together. Okay. And now in the parentheses, he's going back to what he said in the last page. And how do you achieve this level? How do you reveal this power of the fundamental concealment in the Keli? He says, the word neshama is not there. They say below, it should add the word etzem neshama, because that's what he used earlier. The avodah of the etzem neshama, which is what? B'bchinas b'chol ma'idecha, the level of b'chol ma'idecha, which is all-consuming love. But now he goes back and brings also a b'simcha shal mitzvah. Not just doing a mitzvah, but doing it with joy, which was also connected earlier to b'chol ma'idecha, because the joy transcends boundaries, breaks through, and reveals the concealed. Like we spoke at length about Simcha Shal Mitzvah back on page, when he asked the question, how do we reach these levels? So this goes back to page 1261. Where he asked the question, how do you create such a tremendous gilui through mitzvahs in the shtalshlus? So then he introduced Simcha Shamitzah, and that went from 1261 all the way. And on page 1265, he connected very explicitly stating what we've been learning. So Simcha Shamitzah comes also through the Hagdama. Here he's tying it all together because he realized that we learned it earlier. So all these pages that I'm referring to now, he talks about these levels. Simcha Shamitzah goes all the way. He goes to the Shimu and back to page 1271, where he ties it all together, and it's the Simcha Shal Mitzvah on the paragraph from 1271. So it would be worth reading it. So I'll just read a few lines from 1271 just to show you how it all connects. So there he writes, after giving a long discussion of how the containers are rooted higher than the Oyer, that the Shimu is higher than the Kav, he said the following. I'll just read it quickly. I'm reading from 1271. And we understand as well why the Shamshach said, "Ayidei simcha shal mitzvah dafke," is dafke through the joy in mitzvahs. Shal mitzvahs hem b'chinas kelim, because mitzvahs are the level of kelim. Ramach pikudin, ramach evarin the malka. The 248 commands are the 248 divine limbs, the limbs of the king. Because they're containers, we established that their root is higher than the Oyer. That's why there's a mile of mitzvahs over Torah, he says there. And that's why when you do the mitzvah with simcha, explicitly with simcha, mamshichim gile er chodesh mepchinas primis v'atzmus ein sof. You draw down a new energy from primis v'atzmus ein sof, which now we understand a lot deeper what that means after you explained what mitzvahs, Torah mitzvahs are shmoi, the level of who. So it's all coming together. But that comes after the preparation of the Aveda, of the core neshama in the love b'chol meidecha, what we learn now. So he already said what we've learned. The only thing is he didn't explain it yet in the level of neshamas and helam ha'atzmi and hu and shmoy and all these higher levels. He just made the statement there. So even that he said. Because the neshamas, which are the containers, their root is in the Helam Ha'atzmi Ein Sof. Exactly what he said here on page 1286. And it began on page 1282. Okay. And that's the Mila of neshamas over Teda, like he says. I'm going back to page 1271. That's when neshama has the power to stimulate or to awaken, to arouse the level of atzmus, and that there should be a gilia atzmus through mitzvahs. The became a mitzvahs bolvad had is behelam. Because with mitzvahs alone, without this neshamas and the simcha shel mitzvah, it's concealed. And he gives here the example of the Yegiyah, to be able to retrieve revelations from Koyach Hayuli Ha'atzmi, which he compared to being fundamental Helam Ha'atzmi, Dafka Ideh HaYegiyah B'Klei Meiche. It requires a deep exertion, like we spoke about when you want to extract sparks from a flintstone. A flintstone is Helam Ha'atzmi in this mashal. Why? Because there's no flame in there. You can cut open the flintstone, you're not going to find a flame. So it's a Helam She'ena B'Mitzias in the language of Samach Vav. As opposed to a hot coal, which is also concealment, but it's just beneath the surface. You have to just fan the hot coal. So how do you extract the fire, the flame, the spark from a flintstone? It has to be through exertion, which is the Ava B'chol Meidecha of the neshama, the exertion that reaches deeper in a place that on its own would not be able to be expressed. So he's conflating, he's bringing it all together. The etzem neshama and the simcha shel mitzvah, which he's also now equating also with aveda b'chol meidecha, ava b'chol meidecha. And interesting, I just seeing now the parentheses there. He says something similar to what we learned just on the other page, on the previous page, that the truth he says, "Kamei came through mitzvahs kabbalah sale." You also can draw down from sheresh hamitzvahs. Remember, he said there's also amshach zeh hamitzvahs b'shoshen b'chol meidecha, b'kol mokem ikar amshachahu b'agdomas avdaba da'oz b'chins enshin shen haimshim b'chins zotzna atzm b'chins mokem. Oh, remember I asked about it. It's Eishin Shein Shel Mokem. So here it is. Remember, he said that it speaks elsewhere about Eishin Shein Shel Mokem. Where was that? That expression was on the last page. We just learned it. Yeah. And that same paragraph, she explains there, it means you're mamshich from the Ratzana Atzmi b'chinas Mokim. You're drawing it from the core place into Mokim, and that's primarily through Hagdamas Avarabi, even though mitzvahs themselves also through Kabbalah Sale, or now we learn through B'chol Meidecha, also draw that. But the primary is through the Hagdama of Avarabba that we've been discussing now. So I wanted to just show you how it's connected. This is page 1271. Literally now, after he brought it all together, the Neshamas and Teira, the Neshamas and Mitzvahs. Yeah. Which was answering the question. Which was answering the question on page 1281, 1 minute, that why do you need Hagdama of Avarabba B'chol Meidecha? So though he said it earlier, but now he definitely elaborated on it. So when you go back, you actually see all these ideas were already stated. But the Rebbe Rashab fleshed it out more. On page 1281, he asked clearly, why do you need the Avarabba B'chol Meidecha? And that's when he spoke about this, the difference between mitzvahs and the shamas, and how mitzvahs on their own wouldn't do that. So it really goes back to the themes 1271, but really you go back even earlier by basically first to introduce mitzvahs are the kelim that draw down from a higher level, but to do that effectively you need simcha shel mitzvah and avarabba b'chol meidecha, and then when you combine and the neshamas and etzem and neshama, and both together you have all the qualities that we've been discussing. And now he's tying it all together on page where we are now on page 1287.
Yeah, he's saying that in 12.
One second. Yeah, what do you want to ask?
No, he's saying that the simcha של מצווה היא ממש גילוי ערך חודש, רק זהו על ידי הקדמת העבודה בעצם הנשמה יעבוד בכל מצווה.
That's what we're discussing. Yeah, correct.
Also,
It says it right here as well. It says it right here.
Kabbalah Soul, that you can achieve it with the Kabbalah Soul, which seems a lot easier because I do everything with Kabbalah Soul because I don't understand anything. So Ava Rabba seems like a much higher thing, but all of a sudden you threw in Kabbalah Soul. No, I don't quite.
First of all, it's not all of a sudden. It's back on 1271. We learned that back then. The answer is because this is not a black and white picture here. There's different levels because Kabbalah Soul is not what you think it is. Kabbalah Soul doesn't mean just doing it without thinking. Kabbalah Soul is work, that you do it by accepting the yoke of heaven. It's like Yigiyah. It's a different form of Yigiyah. Just like Yigiyah is effort to draw out from the deeper levels, Kabbalah Soul means you're not just doing Torah mitzvahs conveniently. You're doing it with a deep dedication to something greater than yourself. But he says there also, so this is common, as I've explained many times. Sometimes he says mamish, sometimes not mamish. The levels that we're addressing can be drawn down in many different ways. There's a primary way, and there's a much deeper way. So you see, this is going to be common in Chassidus. It's not either or. So you have different measures and levels that he's describing here. Just like tshuva ma'ava rabba, in a way, is deeper even than ava b'chol me'edecha, is what he's implying here. Because now, in the parentheses, he's going to say that explicitly. So let me go back to the parentheses. Then I'm going to try to finish to the end of the paragraph, and then I'll stop for questions. So he says like this now. So how do we reach this hela ma'atzmi? I went back because I wanted to show how he connects the two. But he said even simcha shal mitzvah needs but generally you need both simcha shal mitzvah. And here before he said ubefrat. Now he's saying va'iker, and the primary way of doing this is ayidei tshuva ma'avar rabba. So before, remember, I very much focused on the word ubefrat. He said, in general, you do it through the love, the very intense and all-consuming love of avar rabba b'chol meidecha, ubefrat through tshuva. Now he's saying the ikir ayidei tshuva ma'avar rabba. The primary way is through tshuva ma'avar rabba, and now again he's going to say ukamoy kain, and so too ayidei esek hateidah b'chinas kabbalah shel Malchus shamayim. And so too, you can achieve this through Torah. When you're learning Torah, not just to understand what God wants, and not just to enjoy the wisdom of Torah, but Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim, which means what? Listen to what he says now. Hainu, mashenegele be'etzem nafshei, harotzen amiti de Torah. So Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim, most of us understand it as, even if you don't understand it, you do it. You know, Kabbalah Shelnik. Just you do it without questions. The real avodah of Kabbalah Sale is a lot more than that. It's the point where you're doing it with an effort, like he says here. It's negeya be'etzem nafshi. Person wants to learn Torah because their very life is dependent on it. He's using similar words like ava b'chol meidecha earlier. Negeya be'etzem nafshi, the true rotzen, harotzen amiti de Torah. What is the true desire of God in Torah? That's how he's defining Kabbalah Sale. So when a person does that, that also reaches into hela ma'atzmi. I'll explain in a moment. Let me just finish the parentheses. Shezein yasel mechakale leman de dayik. So there he speaks from a zayir yasel mechakale on the pasuk. Leman de dayik, the mil in the chuchmese. Now, we're not just talking about learning Torah, we're talking about exertion. Like when you learn, when the Arizal would learn, he would sweat, he would perspire. It's a learning with full passion and full commitment with negei benefesh. So in Samach Vav, a big theme in Samach Vav, and I discussed this a number of times, is the Avedas Ha'eved. He speaks there, how do you reach the highest levels of the divine that are beyond us? How do you reach like the Flintstone? The Helen that's beyond our capacity to reach in a regular way. And his answer there is two ways. Yigiyah, exertion. You struggle, you exert yourself, you immerse yourself with full exertion. And that is the equivalent of like striking the Flintstone. It's not enough just to fan, not just enough to do it. You have to push yourself. Like they say, do it till it hurts. A total exertion. You can throw a stone 100 feet, but if you exert yourself, you can throw it 200 feet. That idea, digging deeper to find deeper resources and learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. That's Yigiyah. The second way he talks there is about Kabbalah soil. That even if you have seichel and intelligence, you force yourself to be completely committed, like a soldier in an army, Evet Poshet. It's not an easy thing to do because you're becoming completely loyal and devoting yourself to something that's not you. So that he equates as well as a force that goes beyond our nature. So both exertion and Kabbalah sale is going beyond nature, beyond our natural means, getting out of our comfort zone. And when you do that, you in turn draw down energy that comes also beyond so-called the comfort zone of the Giluyim of Ishtalshlus and even the root of Ishtalshlus. Because you're digging and accessing deeper resources within yourself, and that in turn elicits what he calls here the Avedah. So Torah mitzvahs, you can do mitzvahs anoshim elomoda mechanically by rote. That's on the minimal level. You could also do it with kavanah. He spoke earlier that even when you do mitzvahs b'kavanah, which means your intentions, you're drawing down more energy, and that's why you have schar and Gan Eden. We learned earlier. You do mitzvahs b'kavanah. He said this on page 1282. When you do mitzvahs alone, it says Gam Mesias mitzvahs b'agdamas ava v'yirish al pitam v'das, and then you do the mitzvahs properly because you're doing them out of love. I'm reading on the middle of page 1282. And that's even when you do it with love and awe, not just mechanical mitzvahs. But if you want that the mitzvahs should draw from the deepest levels, there you need to go to the next level, a paradigm shift. And that, so far, the words are Ava Rabba, Ava B'tainugim, Ava B'chol Moedecha, Mesiras Nefesh, Kabbalah Seil, Simcha Shal Mitzvah. They're all different pieces, but they all indicate one thing, going beyond the norm, beyond the routine. And that's why he's equating it. So in essence, it's through that type of Aveda, primarily through Tshuva Ma'aver, but when you do Torah, and earlier he said when you do mitzvahs with Kabbalah Seil, like he just says, Negeya Be'etzem Nafshei, you're drawing down these deepest levels, like explained in Samach Vav, like I just quoted. Now, to finish, after the parentheses, I said I'll just go till the end and we'll stop for questions. So he says like this. Okay, so it's all still, we're still in the middle of a sentence. So when you transform the keli through this Aveda that we just read in the parentheses, the reason he put in the parentheses, I see now, because the main thing he wants to say, so when you do all this, what happens? This will cause the gili, that Malchus on its own, everything is concealed. You'll have the gili of its root that's higher than revelation in Malchus. And this means that Ani Rishon Yizgal b'chinas Ani Achron. That the highest levels are Ani Rishon of Hakesa, and all the way in the Sheirish Ha'atzmi, what he called Shmaya Atzmi, in Atzmus Ein Sof, higher than Giluyim altogether, will be revealed in Ani Achron in Malchus. V'yi Hagili, so that's number one. V'yi Hagili Lamata Mata. Like we said before, the Gili will be not by gradation. It'll be all the way down below because it's coming from a level that's higher than Giluyim. Because it's Gili Mamish. Mamish be Gili. But who? And that is Shagufim Yi Alakus Mamish. The bodies themselves will be Mamish Alakus. Not just a channel for the Lakus, for the godliness of the soul, but the bodies themselves will be exuding, will be revealing, will be radiating with this highest levels of Alakus. And earlier, and the Ayamashin is bar le'il dibra masul kisove aleph. So he's referring us back to volume 1, very early on in volume 1. Like we learned earlier, and through the body, it will also come down into the soul, where he spoke at the bottom of page 1276. Ukamoy kain lamaila, and the same, that's the guf and the shamas lamata, below. Ukamoy kain lamaila, same thing above, in the higher, in Atzilus and higher, the b'chinas Malchus tia b'chinas mashpia b'chol asvidus. Malchus will no longer be biti, daughter, or achesi, sister, which is an equal to Zah. Will be mashpia, like the body is mashpia into the soul. The body into the soul will be b'spia b'chol asvidus, like it's indicated in the pasuk, and then it will be in that day, which means living waters will extend from Jerusalem, chitzim alayam hakadmeinim, and they will infuse, and they will
Chatziyom. Half of them.
What?
Yeah, half of them.
Yeah. And half of that flow will go to the Yam HaKadmeni, which is the Mediterranean, Yam HaGod, Yam HaKadmeni. So you see that pasuk is referring to Malchus, that will come from Yerushalayim, but it'll be greater than the Yam HaKadmeni, because it's rooted in a higher place and is being mashpia to the Yam HaKadmeni, which is referring to more like Zah or the higher levels of Giluyim.
Could we ask now?
Yeah, one second. Let me just see if I want to add any explanation here. Okay. I will say that this what he just summed up now was stated earlier and more at length. But as I said, the Rebbe Rashab now is just tied together really the last 80 pages, because he referred to Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron, referring to different ideas that I just on page 1271, page back to 1213. He's really bringing it all together. So to really appreciate this, you probably have to go back and read the 80 pages again, at least browse through them and see how it all leads back to where we are right now. So I don't know if any of you are going to do that, but I definitely will do it, and I've already done it to some extent. I'm going to do it again. But if you really want to understand these ideas properly and internalize it, not just understand that I understand it, it would be probably, not probably, but for sure would be very necessary to go back and just refresh the ideas, because there's a lot of things we read earlier, a lot of pieces here. And the reason I'm saying it, because the next paragraph, he's going to go back to page 1210. So that's very clear to me that he's so-called, I can't say finished the subject, but he finished everything he wanted to say in this section on this matter about mitzvahs and the reward and the neshamas and so on. So I'll be happy to answer any questions, but remember, a lot of the questions probably would be answered also by looking back. But go ahead. It's your.
We just explained in length that the neshama is the source of all the giluyim from Helem Ha'atzmi. So the guf will go even to a higher level that the neshama did not have before.
It's a good question. The answer is, though he doesn't say it here explicitly, but I referred before, if you go back, bottom of page 1276, let's just look at that for a moment. So there he speaks about this. He says, "He's gala b'chinas helem ha'atzmi, eidni lo, ayin le'rasa, chol b'chinas helem, hein mashem misalam achshav, hein mashem b'chinas helem be'etzem, yilasa le'b'chinas gili mamish." I'm reading bottom of 1276. Okay. וזהו גם כשלוש יסגל למעלה סקלם על הארץ, כידוע שלוש די הגוף למעלה מהנפש, עד שהנפש יקבל ער וחייס מהגוף. אני שקל לשיעתה בכנס הלם ושש בכנס. Okay. I'll answer the question, even though if you think about it, you probably come up with the answer yourself. Just want to see if there's any indication. Okay. Yes, so I'll repeat the question because it's a good question and it's fitting here. We learned that Torah mitzvahs are rooted in Havaya, in Shmoi, the highest levels of Gili, even Etzem Ha'or, but still as Or is in Gili. And the Shamas, he said, are like Kalim, He said those words several times. And like Kalim, they're rooted in the Helam Atzmi. And that's why the neshamas, like he said it on top of page, just to quote where it said, neshamas are Kalim. Yeah. Well, he said it several times. Now he's suddenly saying that the guf is going to be giving, is going to be mashpiyah to the neshama. So the question is, didn't we just say neshama is the kelim? So the answer is, it's everything is relative. Because remember, the way it works is like this. If you ask yourself, what is a neshama compared to a guf? It sounds like the neshama is oir and the guf is keli, right? Neshama gives oir v'chayis, energy and vitality, and the body on its own is kegufa b'lei nishmasa. It's the keli to the that's what all of us would say, and yet we see that he's identifying the shamas with kelim. What does that mean? I'm asking another question, which will answer the first question. So the answer is because the Eibishter made, he says in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Chof, and we learned it earlier that the kelim yotzu v'nifredu, the neshamas rather, the kelim the atzilus. And in the highest root is because the neshamas, as opposed to Torah mitzvahs, that they never lose their revealed connection. Torah mitzvahs can be misused by somebody, but Torah is essentially always remains God's Torah in a revealed way all the way down below. When you read Torah, you're learning God's will and wisdom. Same thing with mitzvahs. A neshama is the expression of lakush shenase yesh. Remember, we discussed the difference between Pedig Beis and Tanya and then Pedig Dalet and Hey. Why the levushim of Torah mitzvah is higher than the nefesh ruach neshama? Because the neshama, even though it's rooted in the chelik elokam and mal mamish and be'etzem, it's one. But at the end of the day, the neshama will become nasa yesh because you need the neshama to be like a child. If the child remains attached to his father, or like a child still in its mother's womb, you'll never have the neshama do its shlichus. Malachim, for example, cannot defy God. They don't have free will. So they are divine messengers, and that's that. Michal, Gabriel, Raphael, Chesed, Gura, Teferes. A neshama, on the other hand, on one hand comes from a much higher place, but it's able to go down lower in this world and not lose its identity and transform the world. But to do that, the neshama has to somewhat be separated, like a child is separated from its father. And in that context, it's like a keli. So the truth is, a neshama has both elements. We say, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. It's a posuk. Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. Ner really has a oir and a keli. There's the flame, and there's the keli for the flame. The wick, the keli that holds, the receptacle that holds the flame. So the truth is, neshamas sometimes are equated with oir. In Shiur Yichud Amun, I think Pedig Zayin, maybe Pedig Dal, Pedig Hey. He says clearly the neshama is like oir and the guf is a keli, and it says in many places like that. On the other hand, the neshama is like an oir that lefi erech, let's say Torah oir, and ner mitzvah is more like a keli. So neshama operates on both levels. Now, when you compare neshamas and gufim, there for sure the guf is far more keli, because without the neshama, the guf has no direction. What is a body without a soul? It's an inanimate corpse, God forbid. So the neshama is critical, not just to energize the body, but also to direct it. Like, how do you know? You wake up in the morning. The neshama is the one that reads and says, Moida ani lefanecha. A body on its own can't do anything. A body, it's like the Gemara says about Chis HaMesim, the muscle. And the Rebbe brings it about Chis HaMesim. The Gemara asks the question, well, the Gemara gives an example with the neshama and guf. Which one? So each one blames the other for any transgression. The neshama says, I couldn't do any sin without my body. And the body says, what could I do without my neshama? So basically the neshama is saying, I can't move. The neshama is compared to like a lame person who can't walk. You need a body to walk. If you can't walk, you can't do an avera. On the other hand, the body is like a blind person because it has no direction of its own. So the Gemara says the Eibishter takes the neshama and puts it together with the goof. He takes the lame, he takes the blind, he takes the lame person, who the cripple, who can't walk, and puts him on the shoulders of the blind person. So the lame person tells the blind person where to walk, and together they both have reward and punishment. The Rebbe brings this regarding why the reward will be neshamas and gufim, because you couldn't do a mitzvah without both. But the process begins, like we learned here earlier, mudfa, murgish, muskel. First, the neshama has to guide the body. And once you do the avodah and the body gets refined, the guf and nefesh habamis get refined more and more and more, ultimately the guf has a root that's even higher than the neshama. So though the neshama is rooted in the kelim and ultimately the helam ha'atzmi, if you really break it down, it's the neshama's begufim that are rooted up there. And the neshama relative to the guf is one step lower in giluyim. In giluyim, the neshama is higher than the guf. But in the atzmi, the helam ha'atzmi, when you don't bring them together, the guf is really ultimately higher than the neshama. But together, they are obviously higher than Torah mitzvahs. So I would say is that this level of hu, or helam ha'atzmi, that we refer to neshamas, really ultimately means neshamas and gufim, because it's the neshamas as they'll come into the bodies. The neshamas themselves have that level, but when you start breaking it down, it's when they bring it into the kelim of the guf, the neshama, which is also kelim, because the neshama has to fit into keli, so it itself is also in a form of a keli compared to the oir. So when you break it down, it's the gufim ultimately that are even in the helam ha'atzmi, are a deeper level of helam ha'atzmi than the neshamas. But they both have they both are connected to that level. That's very clear, and that's how I would explain it. I could elaborate more, but that's how I would explain.
Thank you. That's
Beautiful explanation. Absolutely stunning, pristine explanation. Beautiful.
Thank you. And if you think about it, it's exactly where we're at. You know, the Rebbe Rashab once, the Friedrich Rebbe tells us that Rebbe Rashab once, what's it called? He pulled up his sleeve, and he pointed to his hand, and he said to the Rebbe, to the Friedrich Rebbe, Zeh, see the power of a physical fleshy hand, that for this atzmus poured out all Torah mitzvahs for this hand. The Rebbe brings it in a sikha, a very powerful sikha, Mishpatim Mem Zayin. For this hand, he poured out all Torah mitzvahs. So when you think about it, you say,
or himself.
huh?
Put out Torah mitzvahs or put on himself in this.
Maybe both. I don't remember the exact lashon. Could be himself, but either way, the point being that at the end of the day, when we say neshama is chelik elokam mal mamish, so the Alter Rebbe Taka doesn't talk in chapter 2 about the guf. He doesn't discuss that really. The only place he really discusses it is in Ageres Hakedesh Siman Chaf. So if you just learn Wedged Beis, you think, and the way we all think, the neshama, of course, what's higher than a soul? God's child. But at the end of the day, it's about a child coming into this world. So you have to understand that neshama has both elements to it. And that's really what it comes to the power of it. Yeah. I mean, again, I could elaborate more, but I think that's the.
The guf is the ultimate keli.
No, that's for sure. And that's why la'asid love, you'll have the mile of the guf. Yeah. You know, I would say a neshama to a guf is a little like Torah mitzvahs to a neshama. Because Torah mitzvahs guides the neshama. The neshama guides the body. I mean, I'm talking about in this world where we don't have the natural, where there's the hell and the hester, the concealment. Okay, so we'll stop here at this end of this paragraph.
Yeah, that's what you said just now. Everything in this world is atzmos, but it has to go through the neshama and the guf, the Torah and the mitzvahs. If there's no Torah and mitzvahs, then that's not the point.
Yeah. Look, Torah mitzvahs also, we know Torah leba shamayim hi. The kavanah is not the ruchnis of Torah and the ruchnis of mitzvahs, but mitzvahs maisius. So if you really break it down, Torah mitzvahs also have a oid and a keli. The neshama of the Torah mitzvahs, the so-called the spirit of it. And there's the mitzvahs maisius. We learned that length, that it needs to come down into vovke, it needs to come down into mitzvahs maisius. not enough just to do mitzvahs spiritually. You don't achieve anything. So you see, even in Torah mitzvahs, which is the level of Gilui, you also have a level of Kalim. He called mitzvahs Kalim too. So you see from all of this, everything has Eris and Kalim. It's a question of emphasis, really. That's very clear. I think it's a very important point that I just made. Yeah. Mitzvahs you also called Kalim. And that's also rooted in the highest levels. But again, everything is Lefierach, and you have to just bring it all together. It's very eloquent. At the end of the day, everything is Eris and Kalim. Question is, on what level is it? It could just be Eir and a Keli, or it could be the Sherish HaKeli. That's even higher than that, and that's where you need all these dimensions. It's beautiful because it ultimately shows you what Avodah accomplishes. If the world was just created as is, you have a beautiful world. Mamal Kalam, you have a world, you have Gan Eden. Remember, before Allah of the Lashamra, before Avodah, you have the Shem Avaya, Vayita Gan Be'eden, Vayita Hashem Elikim, Avaya Elikim Gan Be'eden. More than just a regular world, but it still does not reach these deepest levels. It reaches, it's essentially the Giluyim, the art, as the artist created it. But that's not the goal. The artist wants the art to appreciate the artist that's greater than, that's beyond the art. The architect that's beyond the building. And that's where we need all these levels of Aveda. Torah mitzvahs, then the Torah mitzvahs with Kavona, which leads to Gan Eden HaTacht and Gan Eden HaElyon. Then the Torah mitzvahs with Simcha and B'chol Meidecha, Mesiras Nefesh, Kabbalah Seil. And ultimately the level of Tshuva, Ma'avar Rabbah. So you have all these levels that I think are all also very much associated with Mutva Murgish Muskel that we learned. As we grow, it all comes down to where you're at. And as you grow, that I think is also a very vital component as I'm thinking about it. Oh, there's a lot to elaborate, a lot to unpack here, that I can tell you. But at least I feel certain, I would say closure, but at least there's some resolution here to some of the bigger questions that he was addressing. Okay. Anybody want to ask anything else, or we stop here? We'll just... Okay, so we conclude the paragraph, page 1287. From here, he's going to go back to Havaya Yechatu Meriva, or Merivov, which goes back all the way to page 1210, literally 77 pages back. That will be tomorrow. Okay.